Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
It is Monday, November 11th, 2024. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen. This is Slate Sports Podcast. I'm back with you again. I'm Alex Kirshner. I co-host the college football podcast Split Zone Duo, and I'm a contributing writer for Slate, where I write about all kinds of sporting topics. This week, our agenda is to talk about the results of the recent national elections on not just the college sports landscape, but the entire American sports scene. We are going to talk about the state of the NFL's efforts to conquer not just the United States, which it already has, but the entire international world, it seems, with Roger Goodell indicating new intentions to expand on that front. And of course, we are going to talk about the market for brilliant baseball players as Major League Baseball free agency opens up and Juan Soto, among another major superstar, hits the open market. As usual, we've got with us Ben Lindbergh. He is a senior editor for The Ringer. He is the co-host of the Effectively Wild podcast, and he is the co-author of The MVP Machine, How Baseball's New Nonconformists Are Using Data to Build Better Players, and the Only Rule Is It Has to Work, Our Wild Experiment Building a New Kind of Baseball Team. You might know him from his previous work at 538 or Grantland, or as the editor-in-chief of Baseball Prospectus. Ben, good morning.
And in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Little Truman Show reference for you this week. Good to be back, as always.
A wonderful film, really one of the best. It stands the test of time.
Agreed.
In a way that few do. And a special treat this week. Matt Brown is here with us. Matt is the publisher of Extra Points. That is an industry newsletter covering the off-field developments that shape college sports. Matt's subscribers include just about every conference commissioner, quite a few athletic directors, coaches, agents, and of course, lots of us in the sports media. Matt, welcome. There was a pretty big off-field development for college sports this week that I am excited. I don't know if excited is the word, but I'm ready to talk about it with you.
I am excited to be here with you, gentlemen. I am caffeinated. I think I've had enough time to think through the implications of everything that's happened over the past couple of days. I'm with you. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily excited to talk about this specific thing, but we don't get to make the news. We simply have to talk about what happens.
And that we will do. Before we get into our business, as always, we want to thank our Slate Plus members for making this show possible. One method of saying thanks is with a bonus episode. And this week, we will talk about Major League Soccer, what it has gotten out of Lionel Messi, and the state of America's biggest domestic league. You can hear that episode right now as long as you are a Slate Plus subscriber. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. Gentlemen, when I was filling out my ballot a few weeks ago and putting it in a Dropbox in California, my primary motivation was not what the 2024 election would mean for sports. I had other things on my mind. But a lot of people in the sports world believe that Donald Trump's victory and the likely, though uncertain, Republican sweep of the Senate and House will be transformative for parts of the sports world. There's a common view that the federal government will take a lax approach to antitrust enforcement, which could grease the wheels for all kinds of sports deal-making. And in college sports in particular, the effect of our new government is likely to be nothing short of transformative. College sports is hitting a bit of an economic breaking point, you have probably noticed, and whoever controlled government for the next 2 to 4 years was probably going to be at the wheel to heavily shape the construction of whatever the next model is that governs the games that a lot of us love. Matt, do you think that's a fair assessment of the consequences for college sports?
Yeah, unquestionably. And what I think it's important for listeners to understand is that when we talk about the federal government's influence or impact on college athletics, we're not just talking about Big Ten and SEC football and basketball. We've got 1,000 or so schools that play college sports across Division 1, 2, and 3, and they're all very, very different, from gigantic 50,000 plus enrollment R1 state flagship institutions to myriad small liberal arts colleges, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, that are kind of struggling to stay open right now after COVID, after a demographic change that's cratering enrollments throughout the country. And now some of that federal aid that was propping the doors up over the last couple of years is really tapering off. So even independent of what Congress or this White House wants to do explicitly with college sports, the things that they're going to be doing are going to shape higher education so significantly that there's going to be college sports impacts. But I can think of maybe two specific ways, one at the very high end for the biggest budget institutions and one at the low end for the much smaller ones, where I think the legislative and executive branches will have more influence over the direction of college sports than probably at any time since the Supreme Court in the early 1980s.
What's the one for the biggies first? And then I want to ask you about the one for the smallest.
So for the big ones here, we have the question of who's an employee and who gets to regulate how compensation works. Over the last several years, and Alex, you and I have talked about this off air a couple of times here too, the NCAA and commissioners of major conferences have consistently asked the federal government for three things. They said, hey, we need some kind of national NIL standard, because every single state has their own different little rule. And every time we try to enforce even the smallest thing, our butts get hauled into state court and we lose. And there's so many different rules about what's permitted and what's not permitted and who can give money and who can't. It's bad for consumers, bad for students. We need a national standard. Then they say we also then need a national antitrust exemption, so we can enforce literally anything, not just about amateurism, but about agents in NIL, about what constitutes an acceptable deal, what doesn't, when people can do deals without that antitrust exemption. Similar thing. NCAA tries to enforce something, which now they don't really even do anymore. You get hauled into state and federal court. And the last thing that they're asking for is some sort of legal exemption that or statute that clarifies that college athletes cannot be considered employees and are not considered employees, because there's various complaints moving through either federal court or through the National Labor Relations Board that say that some athletes should be classified as employees. And that could be athletes like a Penn State quarterback or a Kentucky basketball player who are on the forefront of generating millions and millions of revenue. And it could also mean Dartmouth men's basketball players who don't. A team that will get outdrawn by a good high school basketball team in most mid markets in this country, and potentially cross country runners or swimmers or folks down the line there. So that hasn't happened because control over the federal government has been divided. Like you kind of insinuated earlier, Alex, nobody other than like 6 NIL attorneys on Twitter went into the voting booth to make a decision with college sports in mind. Like that's not really a voting constituency. So it wasn't an issue that had a lot of juice inside Capitol Hill, and Republicans wanted one thing, Democrats wanted another. When you have divided government, nothing really happens. But now we have likely a unified Republican sweep. And I don't think I'm being an apocalyptic doomer lib here when I say that. And also we have a Republican sweep, and institutions that might be otherwise counted on to check executive power are likely to be weakened under this current administration. So it's much easier to get something that is more sympathetic to the idea that athletes should not be employees passed. Like the idea of like Senator Tommy Tuberville having significant influence over the future of college sports. That's not a joke that you and I might have made in a text thread. That's a real thing now.
And we discussed some of the implications pre-election on the podcast when we talked about, for instance, Ted Cruz becoming chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. He said he'll make college sports legislation a very, very high priority, and he has signaled that he is pretty pro-NCAA. Of course, the president has a lot of oversight over the NLRB, and that plays a big factor in this too. So during Trump's first administration, his appointee rescinded a memorandum that staked out a position that college athletes are employees, and it's likely that his new appointee will do the same. And gosh, he's talked about dissolving the Department of Education, right? So the implications of that could be sweeping. Now, whether he will actually follow through on those things is another question. But I think in addition to everything Matt is laying out there, there's also implications for Title IX, right? The Office of Civil Rights, which is under the Department of Education. So if that department continues to exist, then whoever is making those decisions there is likely to be a little less protective of those enforcement conditions than someone under Kamala Harris would have been, for instance. So everything points more toward a pro-NCAA outcome. I guess if you were to take a devil's advocate stance, you could point out that Trump himself hasn't really staked out a position on athletes as employees. He certainly said a lot about college athletes, but not that particular aspect of them. He kind of curried favor with organized labor with some success in the run-up to the election. He's obviously pro-capitalism and getting yours. We've seen people like Brett Kavanaugh being no fan of the NCAA, right-wing politicians no fan of universities. So there's sort of a ideological divide there that, in theory, might not lead to a fully unified backing of the NCAA. And of course, the majorities are not so vast that something couldn't be filibustered or that you might not have defections. You might still need some bipartisan support.
Matt, I want to ask you about that ideological split to the extent there is one. Because I think some people may have a slightly outdated understanding of the state of play on this. It was pretty interesting in, let's say, 2019, 2020, 2021, how there did seem to be some ideological melding between left and right on college sports. Most famously, this manifested in the NCAA v. Alston, or Alston v. NCAA, Supreme Court decision, which was one of the NCAA's biggest losses, which was a 9-0, as of course many Supreme Court cases are. And everyone from Sonia Sotomayor to Brett Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas seemed to want to take a whack at the NCAA. But it does seem like those days of Republicans and Democrats are similarly in lockstep about the evils of college sports economics have somewhat subtly ended. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. And it's one thing in 2019 to say, hey, the complete price fixing on any kind of athlete compensation and the draconian amateurism enforcement mechanism sucks. Everybody in Congress would have said the NCAA sucks. And it was not difficult to find a very right-wing senator from an SEC state whose school is under investigation to come there and want to get in front of the podium and decry the evils of Indianapolis. It's a very different political calculus now. And we saw that shortly after, I think, 2021, when California gets the credit for being the first state to really push for NIL for maybe more social justice reasons. But then I think it was Florida that really kind of drove the bus into forcing the NCAA to make some changes. And that was Republican authored legislation and Republican signed legislation. A lot of the southern states were quick to move on this year too. But over the last couple of years, you've had some Democrats who look at this as an economic justice issue and also an avenue to expand organized labor. If you have a national college athletes union and you have states that prohibit public employee unions or are very hostile to unions in the Southeast, but they don't want to disadvantage Alabama football or Clemson football, this is an avenue to kind of chip away at that a little bit. That's not the complete Democratic position. That is the position of some Democrats. And then you have some Republicans who are maybe more motivated by anti-unions, anti-organized labor, racial resentment, or other factors, even more than they are capitalism, which, surprise, like that's part of the appeal of Trumpism and part of kind of how the new populist right is set up. You also have a surprisingly effective line of argument that's popped up in a lot of conservative circles about the need to defend women's sports. And part of that has been in the context of trans athletes and participating in women's sports. And it's been Republican governors and Republican lawmakers that have really, really pushed hard against that. But there's also an argument that expanding employment status to even just football and basketball players will drive significant revenue reallocation away from Olympic sports, which will hurt women's sports. Like many liberals will tell you that. I'll tell you that. Like that is the thing that will happen. And if you want, we'll see how serious some of these lawmakers are about the preserving women's sports line. But the Attorney General in South Dakota sued the NCAA over the House settlement in part on these specific lines, that this will lead to a reallocation of resources away from women's sports. So I understand the argument why somebody would say, well, just because Republicans control everything and Trump's in charge doesn't mean that we're going to have anti-athlete union or anti-athlete employment status legislation. I think that's a little bit of wishful thinking. And it's one thing to paint a more bipartisan, less ideological worldview when you have divided government and you're not completely responsible for all of your actions. It's another thing when you won a not particularly close election and you have all the levers of government. I don't think that we're going to get a 9-0 conservative Supreme Court decision directly against something that Ted Cruz and Donald Trump want.
Ultimately, how much of this do you think is settled legislatively? Whether it's athletes not being employees or the NCAA getting an antitrust exemption, and how much of that is settled, in the halls of Congress versus courts, or for that matter, in the halls of Congress versus in state houses, which, as you mentioned, drove a lot of the bus when name, image, and likeness reform was coming into play a few years back?
That's a really good question. And I am inclined to believe, I'm taking a little bit more of a cynical or fatalist look, I think, at the next 2 years. I think more of this is likely to happen in Congress. It's probably true that outside of the Supreme Court, and as long as the National Labor Relations Board kind of exists, well, that's an open question, I think, in my view. That there will be some judges in some federal courts that are going to be more sympathetic to athlete-employee cases, and I think anti-NCAA cases generally, right? If you want to, like Diego at Vanderbilt is suing the NCAA over whether his JUCO year should count as eligibility, and I think you're going to see other people suing to challenge various eligibility statutes. You can probably find some judges to rule against the NCAA, but I think it is more likely that before we go through another 2-3 year process to get to the Supreme Court, that Ted Cruz and Tommy Tuberville and a couple of other senators who are more invested in this particular issue will just say, we've solved it. Athletes aren't employees. And here's the new paradigm. NCAA, you figure everything else out. I could be wrong. If you are an attorney who is professionally invested in this movement, or if you're involved in athlete labor, or if you're involved in the NIL industrial complex, I'm sure you'll take a different view. Could be right. But I am of the mind now that if conservatives want something to happen at this point over the next 2 or 3 years, it's just going to happen.
If I could broaden the scope of the implications of another Trump presidency here for the sports landscape, people don't have to cast their minds back that far. It's just 4 years ago that he was last in the White House. But Trump is an extremely sports-centric president, probably the most sports-forward president we've ever had, for better or worse. Obviously, he has deep ties to wrestling, to boxing, to UFC, to football. He's also just a prolific sports opinion haver. Some of those opinions are pretty benign in sort of a sports radio sense. Some are more malignant. So this is a guy who tweets or truths or whatever about how he hates the NFL's dynamic kickoff rule, or how he objects to Dave Roberts' bullpen usage. I don't know how he felt about Roberts' performance in the 2024 postseason. Most people thought it was much better. But he has such inextricable ties to the sports industry. His campaign manager and future chief of staff, Susie Wiles, is Pat Summerall's daughter. Linda McMahon is the chair of his transition team. So for anyone who wants to try to steer into the stick to sports kind of line, that's just impossible to do under Trump. And it's been a bit easier under Biden. So we're going to get back to a world where most likely athletes are turning down invitations to the White House. Maybe we see more activism, as we've talked about in recent weeks. Athletes have been a little less vocal under the Biden administration than they were late in the Trump administration. We'll see if some of that is rekindled. Of course, he was constantly warring with leagues. He was wading into the Colin Kaepernick situation, athletes kneeling, trans athletes, of course, and the threats he has made about the legislation and the bans he would enact in that area. We also, of course, have many international events that will put the spotlight on this country because we'll be hosting them in the coming year. Whether it's the Club World Cup next year, the World Cup the year after that, the Olympics in 2028. So Trump's stances on immigration and trans athletes and tariffs and Russia's participation in the Olympics, there's really no telling what sort of objections that will enact. And, of course, he said on Jim Gray's podcast the day before the election that it would take him the better part of 15 minutes to get a deal done between the PGA and Live Golf. Of course, he also said he could broker peace between Russia and Ukraine in one day. So I don't know if that's going to be the same day. If he can squeeze the 15 minutes into his lunch break while he's ending that war, we'll see. But there are just going to be a whole lot of ties to sports, to the White House, that for a few years now have lain a little bit fallow.
I think I actually want to use that real quick to maybe talk about the implications on the smaller end of college athletics, because you raise something here that's very important, which is immigration. And maybe some of your listeners know this, maybe not everybody does, but many college sports from the Power 5 down to Division 3 are heavily international. The most collegiate tennis programs outside of the very tippy top of the handful of P4 schools are majority international. Sports like college golf, college swimming, men's and women's soccer tend to really draw from international pipelines. And then also lots of schools, from regional public institutions that are a little bit smaller to more tuition-dependent liberal arts colleges, really depend on international enrollment to stay open. Because a rich family from South Korea or China or India or Brazil is more likely to pay full tuition than somebody from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, or somebody from 20 minutes down the street. In a world where there is a crackdown on Chinese in particular, but a crackdown on international visas, or where maybe international athletes decide to self-select to not enroll in the United States or not pursue collegiate athletic opportunities as often, which I've had some higher education industry professionals tell me that's already kind of the case. That doesn't just hurt the Olympic movement. That doesn't just hurt the quality of play for some of these Olympic sports. On some level, it could keep some schools from being open or closed. If you lose 15% of your international enrollment and they were all paying $45,000, $50,000, $60,000 at the Division II, Division III level, that could have catastrophic implications. I would not be surprised if in the next year or two, we see 40 NCAA member institutions across 1, 2, and 3 completely closed down. Athletics, doors, the whole thing.
This relates directly to the enrollment cliff that you and I have talked about, yep. Right? This was not driven by any political party. This was just driven by birth rates. Roughly 18 to 25 years ago, Americans stopped having fewer kids. And if you do not take an ardently pro-immigrant stance toward bringing more people into your colleges, then you're running out of people, whether there's a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House. That's exactly it. We stopped having as many babies, and then some of the babies that we did have decided not to go to four-year institutions. So we're as a country, we are not producing as many four-year residential college-bound individuals. So you're right. You either import them or you continue to more expensively compete over a limited number of students, which is what's already happening with international recruitment. It's already happening across the board. The last year and a half, 2 years, we began to see several small colleges merge with larger ones, and I expect that. And I would expect that even if Harris had won, but because of the existential threats to international enrollment and potentially, federal funding as well, I think that's going to continue over the next couple of years. Ben, sports does love a deal, and you mentioned the Live Golf PGA Tour situation that Trump seems like he might be involved in, given his extreme closeness to the Saudi golf effort. But it seems that some people in sports are already very excited about where this could go. David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, is clearly foaming at the mouth for some sort of merger and acquisition activity in the media partner front, which obviously impacts sports. A lot of Republicans, though not all, seem to want Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission to be sent to the exits. To what extent do you think M&A deal-making is going to be a part of the sports story the next 2 to 4 years? And do you think it's different than it would have been if Harris had won. Of course, if Harris had won, there were Democrats. There were some of her donors who wanted her to fire Lena Khan anyway and take a softer approach to antitrust.
Right. Harris's stance wasn't completely clear whether she would just continue all the policies of Joe Biden. Of course, there was the notorious View interview where she failed to come up with a way that she would do something different from what Biden has done. But people did wonder whether she'd be a little more pro-big business than Biden was. And of course, the Biden administration has really been a break from the previous few decades when it comes to cracking down on mergers and acquisitions and trying to break up these big companies. So it's hard to say exactly whether Harris would have continued on the same course, but it seems pretty clear that Trump will not and that there will be a reversal here. So Rory McIlroy was talking about the potential for Trump to broker some sort of deal between PGA Tour and LIV, and he expressed some optimism. And then he said, but I think as the president of the United States again, he's probably got bigger things to focus on than golf. I don't know that that's completely clear in Trump's case, given how often he golfed during his previous administration. And you never really know what he will decide to make a priority or what he thinks will play well or what is just a personal interest and obsession of his, as golf clearly is, given how many times he brought it up during the campaign and used it as a cudgel against Biden even. So, given his ties and his family's ties to Saudi Arabia, one would think that he would be well positioned to make something happen there. And yes, just the broader environment, one would imagine and forecast, would be much more friendly to deals. So whether that is mergers on the broadcast side, potentially increased consolidation there as we sort of have this free-for-all to figure out what the landscape looks like post-cable bubble bursting, whether that's satellite providers merging, whether it's some of the new networks that have gotten together to propose sports streaming strategies, right? And packages that would unite rights deals from various providers, which seemed like that could run into regulatory hurdles. Maybe those hurdles are a little lower now. So I would certainly expect that there could be a wave of consolidation after the Biden administration put the brakes on that for a bit.
Matt, no matter how all of this unfolds, it does seem inevitable to me that Ted Cruz is going to be a name that I have to read a lot as it relates to sports for the next 3 years. There's no way to escape that, is there?
I mean, in our world, we kind of knew a lot about Ted Cruz because it was a good way for us to figure out what we should bet on a particular game. There's a good chance that the home team's going to lose if Cruz shows up. But yeah, if you're doing off the field sports stuff, especially in the college world, you're going to have to follow his office. You're going to have to care even more about antitrust and labor law and potential other mergers and acquisitions, not just in college sports, but across sports generally. I definitely agree. I think you are going to see more consolidation, not just among potential broadcasters, but among a lot of the software tools and supporting infrastructure that runs the sports industry.
I can sense the excitement in your voice as we look forward.
I love it, right? Like many people on the internet think, oh, Matt's just here to write about video games and like mid-major Western realignment. No, what really gets me out of bed is knowing who is next on Learfield's acquisition, leaderboard here. What is Playfly going to do next? What's next for multimedia rights in the college sports landscape? Listen, that's why lots of people pay me $9. Can't get enough of that stuff.
4 more years.
On the subject of large businesses hoovering up more and more of the world, the NFL clearly sees its manifest destiny unfolding all across this planet of ours. We will discuss it. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help you when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
If there's one thing sports fans love as much as watching games, it's talking about them, especially the stats. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
Back here on Hang Up with Matt Brown and Ben Lindbergh, I am Alex Kirshner. The NFL was in Munich on Sunday, staging one of those games that was close but not good. The moribund Carolina Panthers beat the also moribund New York Giants in overtime after the Giants fumbled. It was the fifth and final international game of this season for the NFL. There are also 5 on the slate for next year. But the NFL wants the number to go up in the future. Roger Goodell said on Sunday from Munich that the league was aiming to get to 8 international games. They're going to be in Spain soon. They're hoping to get back to Mexico City. And the Pittsburgh Steelers seem pretty intent on playing a game in the owning Rooney family's homeland of Ireland. Add those to the 3 currently in the United Kingdom, plus 1 in Brazil, plus this one in Germany. That would be 8, perhaps as soon as 2026. It's a lot, but the NFL clearly knows how to make a buck. I wouldn't argue against them in that context. Matt, are you excited about the possibility of being able to go and have a Guinness at Temple Bar and then head over to Aviva Stadium to watch a Steelers game one day? Or am I projecting?
Well, probably more excited about going back to São Paulo and watching the Bears or watching anybody else back in the motherland. But I actually think this is pretty cool. And I'm not somebody that's typically given to cheerleading the NFL as an institution, but I think this could be a real positive on a lot of different ways, right? Part of the reason that the NFL is so invested in trying to globalize isn't just because there's so much more money to be made in a way that the professional soccer and increasingly the NBA has figured out. It's also a way to broaden the talent pool. This is beginning to change a little bit, but if we're the only country that really plays football, almost all of the players are going to come from here. And we're starting to see more of talent development happening in Canada, happening in Australia, not just with punters, but overwhelmingly with punters, and slowly but surely beginning here in Western Europe. If more people are exposed to the sport of football when they're younger, and then you pair that with an infrastructure to allow people to find and engage with football and then eventually play football, you're planting seeds that won't grow for several years, but it's something that has the potential to improve the actual quality of the league. And unlike most other major professional sports leagues in the United States, the NFL's never really figured out how to do that at scale. They tried NFL Europe, they tried other developmental leagues. It hasn't really worked out. I do think that sometimes American fans take for granted the fact that there really are a lot of people worldwide who care about professional football. It's fun to watch. And it's fun to watch even if you don't understand the sport all that much. That's how I feel about hockey. I don't want to know strategy. I want to clap like a seal when somebody gets checked and goes flying 3 rows up, and I want to see fast action. And I'm like literally committed to not learning more about that so I can engage with it on a superficial level like I used to do with sports. A lot of people feel that way about pro football. The challenge, I think, isn't just showing up to have a game and selling it as an enormous corporate junket. It's building the infrastructure to support the game after you leave, which means, can people watch it on television? Can people find it in a bar? And can people find a way to play the game even recreationally when you're not here? And that is more difficult than getting one game there. And I think how the NFL does that is going to be really fascinating.
Yeah, some of it's got to be driven by the sense that, well, maybe we've maxed out in the U.S., more or less. How much more popular can football be here? If you want to keep growing, you've got to go global, especially if you want to offset any fears you have about the future of football, whether it's Gen Z and younger being more fractured in terms of what it pays attention to, or the declining youth participation in contact football, at least. So if you forecast that maybe you've peaked or close to peaked, and it's dangerous to say that about football because it appears to just be on an elevator ride to the roof. But why not expand to the rest of the world? There are many more non-Americans than there are Americans. And there are plenty of football fans in Germany, as we've seen, given the enthusiastic response to this game, right? And there's the history there, as Matt mentioned, with NFL Europe, the defunct developmental league. The NFL says there are approximately 19 million fans in Germany. I don't know how they define fan. They say 3.6 million follow the NFL closely. And the ratings there, even as they're just a pittance compared to the ratings domestically, they're still significant. The games that were shown during the 2023 year, 710,000 average viewers in Germany during the 7 p.m. games. That was up considerably from the previous year. About 2 million people watched the Super Bowl in Germany, which is more than double the number who watched it in the UK, where the NFL has concentrated its international efforts for decades at this point. So in 2023, Sportico said the international series games had yielded little to no profit, but these are seen as sort of loss leaders to try to seed enthusiasm for the game globally. And as Matt said, to try to deepen the fan base and the talent pool for the actual competitors. So what's the end game here? Everyone always wonders, right? Is it that you'll have more NFL stars from foreign countries? Is it that there will eventually be expansion overseas? Will you have a division of teams internationally playing each other and coming over to the US a few times a year? That's probably a ways down the road, but you have things like the International Player Pathway Program. You have the International Home Marketing System. A lot of this is just a cash grab, and it's just trying to broaden your base of potential sponsors so that you can get local and international revenue from advertising. But it's also one of these situations where it seems like, what harm could it do, right? Will it be transformative? That still remains to be seen, I think, after all these years. But it can't hurt. If you get more people interested in football, that can only be a good thing for the NFL.
I have been of the view for a few months that it is an eventuality that there will be an international franchise or several in the NFL. And that's partly for the cool connecting the world, grow the game reasons that Matt alludes to. But also, I think because it provides stadium leverage for the existing 32 franchises. I thought about this a lot when the Kansas City Chiefs were attempting to get local taxpayers to pay more money for years and years and years toward Arrowhead Stadium renovations earlier this year. They were soundly rejected in a referendum that was also connected to the Kansas City Royals' efforts to build a new stadium. And I think part of the reason they were rejected is that the Chiefs' threat to leave Kansas City, Missouri is really just to go across the river to Kansas, because there's just not any other real estate in the United States where an NFL team could move at this point and not be really upsetting another franchise now that LA and Vegas are off the board. But hey, you add the rest of the world as places where you could move a team toward, and hey, maybe you can get the Hamilton County taxpayers or whatever it might be, Jackson County taxpayers, depending on the team, to give you a little bit more money to build something in the United States.
Right. Instead of crossing the river, you cross the pond. I do think it becomes easier if you can get a star who hails from some other country where they would really drum up the interest and fan the flames of fandom, as we've seen in the NBA, in MLB, which have these deep roots and have international games going back so long. And of course, in baseball's case now, you have MLB putting out press releases bragging about playoff ratings in Japan, or combining US and Japanese TV ratings to drum up, to emphasize how global the audience has been. We're about to talk about Roki Sasaki, the latest elite talent to come over from Japan. So once you get to that point where you have enough of an infrastructure built up and enough multi-generational, intergenerational loyalty to a sport that you're suddenly churning out stars, and we get a great percentage of the players in the league made up of international players, as we see in MLB and the NBA now, then it becomes kind of a self-sustaining cycle and a virtuous one where you just constantly pull in new players, you make the caliber of play better, and at the same time, you're making it easier for people internationally to get invested in your sport. And football, there's the NFL Academy, their efforts to do that, but it hasn't quite cracked that nut. It's far from the most popular sport internationally that is called football, right? So there's a long way to go relative to those other sports, but you only have to look at basketball and baseball to see what the potential payoffs are.
Ben, you touched on two factors I want to explore here real quick because they run up against some recent reporting that I just did. Because we're talking about Japan. I recently spent some time in Hawaii, and not just because I needed a mini vacation and wanted to go to Hawaii, but I was embedded with the University of Hawaii athletic department and talked to their AD and their marketing team, and was working on a bunch of stories about how that program functions because it's so different from the rest of the country. And obviously, their location is a significant disadvantage in many ways. But one of the things that multiple people, as coaches and administrators, pointed out to me, like as one of their short-term goals, is to build much stronger and deeper relationships with Japan. It's a 5-hour flight from Honolulu to California. It's only like 6.5 to get to Tokyo. And there's a ton of Japanese people that live and vacation and have ties to Hawaii and vice versa. Hawaii, I think I can say this on the air without me getting in trouble, was actually supposed to play a major Power 4 team in Japan in the 2026 season. That game was canceled in football. Yes, this is. I don't know if this has been public or not. I'll say it. Like that was scheduled. A team signed a contract. That team then joined another conference that required them to travel across the country a lot more, and then said, we don't think we want to go to Japan, and then also potentially the East Coast. And you guys can figure out maybe who I'm talking about. But part of the appeal here isn't just because Hawaii thinks that this will help them sell tickets and find potential Hawaiian athletes. One, they want to be able to grow their merchandise business, which is something that I think a couple of schools in the Pac-12 targeted when they wanted to play games in China. They want people to buy UCLA shirts. They want people to wear Hawaii uniforms, and not just because as a tourist thing, but because this is our nationality's team in America. Essentially, there's probably no more Japanese college or fan base than Hawaii, and so being there and extending that merch helps commercialization on a couple of other ways. The other reason, and I also think this is part of the reason why the NFL is also bullish about expanding internationally, is when you play games in Asia and you play games in Western Europe, you open up a different time slot, a different TV window for your American audience when you're playing, whether that's early in the morning or very late at night. And when you do that, you expand gambling. And you have a bunch of new people that are now invested in that particular time slot. And if that enriches your gaming partners, if the NFL or other leagues figure out ways to kind of monetize that, that's something Hawaii is really looking at doing as the chase game in college sports. When hey, are you hammered? And did you lose all of your other bets today? Well, you can make it all back at the Hawaii UNLV game at 1:00 in the morning.
What a country. What a country.
What a country. What a sport. What a world, right? And many times, maybe people do things for maybe not the most noble reasons, but the end result ends up being a positive. That might be part of what happens here with international expansion in big time sports. Some of it's noble, some of it's maybe not so noble.
Yeah. And how many times have you read a story about someone who develops a gambling problem and suddenly their desire to bet at all hours, that insatiable drive, leads them to betting on sports being played overseas that they know nothing about? So from the NFL's perspective, if they could instead just be betting on football at all times and all days, even better for them, right? And we talked about how Goodell forecasted going up to as many as 8 international games as soon as next season. He also said that if the league expands to an 18-game regular season, which also seems inevitable, that he wants to see 16 games played in international markets. So we're looking at potentially doubling even that expanded total. So the goals are pretty ambitious here.
Matt, why do you think the Pacific Rim has not yet been in the NFL's repertoire? It's kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, Major League Baseball has gone just very recently to Japan. There is plenty of addressable market there for American athletics. I'm curious why the NFL isn't there.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And college sports has. Like there have been college football games played in Japan. The Ivy League actually.
Barry Sanders played one in 1988.
Yeah, the Ivy League, I think, plays one almost every year against Japanese college football players. There are high school and college teams in Japan. A part of the reason I think you still see college jumping in that more, to kind of go back to our earlier conversation, there's a different need for colleges. Like I actually think the Pac-12's initiative to play multiple basketball games there was very smart. And I've had people who worked on that endeavor say, yeah, we made 7 figures a year from that effort because they were also trying to recruit students. And that's where so many graduate students and undergraduates come from the Pacific Rim, and tie into a much larger consumer market. I'm not really sure, to be honest with you, why that hasn't been as big of a priority. Like I know just from my own life, having traveled and having family connections to these places, there's already a ton of NFL fans in Mexico. There's a lot already there in Brazil, from Brazilians who are constantly traveling to Florida, who are already watching American television. There's a tradition of prep football and college football that already exists in Mexico, and that's a little bit easier to get to. So I don't know if it started in South America and Western Europe because there was already an infrastructure there, but I would agree, if you're going to try to go globally, going to Japan and going to Australia, I think where people already have an appetite for kinetic sports, contact sports, I think that would make sense too. But I'm just a humble newsletter writer.
Alex, what do you think the threshold is for deciding when it's time to expand internationally? And I don't mean the Bulls moving to Toronto or something. I mean across continents. When does the NFL know that the time is ripe?
That's a really good question. I bet they have a trigger like that somewhere in a document locked in a file cabinet at Park Avenue, New York. I think that it probably comes like in conjunction with a broadcast rights agreement renewal cycle, right? Wouldn't that make the most sense? I mean, not that you could spin this up in 2 or 3 years, but let's say in 5 or 6 years, the NFL will have new broadcast renewal rights up. Maybe when you do those deals, depending on when the NFL opts out of its current deals, maybe you'll look and say, all right, 10 years from now, they're going to be up again. And we'd like to be ready to do something 10 years from then. I would imagine you would peg it to your TV negotiation cycle because that's when you can really cash in on the time slot thing that Matt alludes to.
If this helps, when I've talked to people on the college side, what I've been told is if you want to make an international expansion, if you want to have an event that performs well internationally, you need 3 things. You need a very tiny baseline of audience interest. It would be, I think, harder to do a professional football game in India or Bangladesh or in places where there's not as much initial interest. You need a broadcast partner, and you need a government partner. To the extent that the broadcast versus government partner, I think, may vary depending on the country. It's obviously more important to have the government on your side in China than maybe it might be in France. But you need somebody else to help underwrite the project and assume some of the risk and to help with some of the distribution in a place where you don't have that. In many Western European countries, the NFL has that now. They have multiple willing public and private partners to shill this thing and make it work and distribute it. And in places where the market isn't developed enough, or they haven't bribed the right guy, or there isn't a football fan somewhere in parliament, it doesn't make as much sense. It's not something I think any league, including the NBA or MLB, can really do unilaterally.
And maybe you wait for the successor to the Concorde, the next supersonic airliner, to be introduced several years down the road. That'll help a little bit with the travel time. But I do think that the NFL is well positioned when it comes to the travel relative to other sports, with more games on the schedule, of course, because baseball, for instance, they play a London series every year in the summer, but the games in Asia, the games in Australia, those are usually reserved for preseason exhibitions. Yeah. It would be difficult to do on a baseball schedule when you're playing 162 games, even the NBA, right? As many games as they play. Whereas football, you're playing 1 game a week. You could build in some extra rest there. You have some down days as it is. Now, of course, the demands on football players' bodies are extreme, even compared to those on athletes in other sports. But the schedule is more conducive to that if you're not expanding multiple teams overseas at the same time that would play each other locally. If you actually have to have one hopping across vast bodies of water to play other teams in the U.S., it's just more feasible for the NFL to do that than it is for, say, MLB.
Matt Brown writes and publishes Extra Points. That is an industry newsletter that serves college sports fans really well, and I think is a great read for sports fans of all persuasions. Is at extrapointsmb.com. Go read it. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Hang Up this week.
Fellas, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Really great to have Matt with us this week. Ben and I will stick with you. Up next, one incredible ball player is about to get $600 million or so, and another is about to come to Major League Baseball for, well, maybe about $600 million less than that other great ball player. What is the state of the market for the world's most sought-after baseball talent? Ben will tell us. This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com? The Federal Reserve announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out Public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up, and once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/hangup. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA plus SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed, not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosure/bond-account for more info.
It's game time. And if you've got a hunch about this NBA season, you could turn it into a big win on FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win.
Ooh, that guy's hotter than a microwave burrito.
Now that's a red hot hunch.
21 plus and present in Virginia. Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus vest that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Back with Ben Lindbergh, I'm Alex Kirshner here on Hang Up and Listen. Major League Baseball's free agency is upon us, and the big story that the industry has been looking forward to for several years is indeed here. Juan Soto, the modern-day Ted Williams clone who most recently co-led the Yankees to the World Series along with Aaron Judge, is free to sign wherever. He is going to get a lot of money, probably from one of the New York teams, and probably in the amount of roughly, give or take $100 million, $600 million. Ben, can I trouble you for a guess on exactly how many years, dollars, and the team are in Juan Soto's future?
I'm famously averse to predictions because I'm no Nostradamus, but I will humor you with one here.
Yes.
Just because I care about you, Alex. So I will say that he will get a record contract. Now, that is not much of a really bold prediction, although you might say, wait, didn't Shohei Ohtani just get a $700 million deal last winter? Are you telling me that Soto is going to top that? Well, no, I don't think he's going to get $700 million, but Ohtani's deal was, of course, famously extremely heavily deferred. And so in terms of its actual present day value, it was more like 438-ish million, a mere 438 million. And for competitive,
wow.
Yes, I know, the poor guy. It's okay though, because he gets a lot of endorsement dollars too. So don't worry about him, even though, you know, sometimes he gets swindled by his former confidant and interpreter. But that barely made a dent in his finances. I think he's doing okay. And for competitive balance tax purposes, Ohtani's deal was valued at about $46 million per year in average annual value. Soto, by all appearances, is going to easily leapfrog those numbers because he's young. Not that Ohtani was old, but Soto is significantly younger than Ohtani was last winter. He just turned 26 on the first day of the World Series. And so I think he's looking at probably something in the vicinity of $600 million, and that is without any heavy deferrals or options or escalators or any financial oddness. If I had to guess an exact length and number, I'd say that he gets $46.3 million per year, just slightly ahead of what Ohtani is earning for competitive balance tax purposes. And I'll say he gets a 13-year deal, which would take him up to about $602 million. Now, that's a big number, but he's a heck of a player, although as many teams as there are that could use him and would benefit from Soto's services, that obviously does take some teams out of the running realistically.
The talk, just the chatter, is that it's going to be the Yankees or the Mets. I have no reason to doubt that. Do you have any reason to doubt that? Or do you imagine that there could be other suitors that have both the willpower and the resources, the willpower being very important?
I don't think they'll be the only ones in it. It's already been announced that Soto will be meeting with Hal Steinbrenner, owner of the Yankees, and Steve Cohen, owner of the Mets. And of course, we should say that Juan Soto's agent is the super agent, Scott Boras, who is not known for handing out sweetheart deals. So we didn't get a Subway series. We might well get a Soto series in the Soto sweepstakes here. But there are a lot of other teams that theoretically could and should be in the running. You have the San Francisco Giants, for instance, who have missed out on a string of high-profile free agents. They tried to sign Aaron Judge. They tried to sign Carlos Correa. Actually, they briefly did sign Carlos Correa, and then they backed out of that deal after his physicals came in. But they have had money to spend, and they just haven't been able to find the right person to splurge on, so they should be in it. The Blue Jays are perennially in the running for top free agents. They thought they had landed Shohei Ohtani briefly last year, that whole flight tracking saga. I think the funniest outcome would be if he just went back to the Washington Nationals, the team he started with, after moving around and being traded a couple times early in his career, which is unusual for a player of his caliber. But of course, he reportedly rejected an extension offer from the Nationals years ago. But hey, they're ramping up again. They have room to spend. And then the Dodgers. The Dodgers are going to be mentioned in any conversation about any top free agent. They did recently say that Mookie Betts will be moving back to the infield, which was seen by some as a sort of a signal to Soto, hey, we have an outfield vacancy here. So you can never count them out in any negotiation. And then you have your usual dark horses, your Padres, your Phillies, your Red Sox. There are plenty of teams that in theory could afford Juan Soto because he's an incredible player. And as much as you might worry about a 13-year deal for a baseball player, Soto seems about the most risk-free player you could come up with, given that he is a young 26. He is just a preternaturally talented hitter. Granted, he's not a great all-round player. He's
bad
kind
outfielder.
He's kind of a middling defender. His metrics and performance have been up or down. He's been bad at times. He's looked better at times. And on the bases, he's nothing special either. But he's just so great in the batter's box. Just really the platonic ideal of a hitter, essentially. Just a perfect offensive force. He gets on base, he walks, he can hit for power, he has incredible plate discipline. He's also a really entertaining player, just fun spectator experience because he's in the box, he has his shuffle, he is constantly glaring at the pitcher and nodding at the pitcher and gesticulating. He's just a ton of fun to watch, and he's immensely valuable. If anything, he was overshadowed, he was a little underrated perhaps this season, given how great his teammate Aaron Judge was, and of course Shohei Ohtani. Juan Soto was sort of the third musketeer and was maybe undermentioned because of the historic nature of those other two guys' seasons, but he is just unbelievable.
So it's a very good time to be Juan Soto. I think that is credibly established. Congrats in advance to him and his agent Scott Boras on what is coming their way over the next couple of weeks or months. Soto demonstrates that if you can get to free agency, let alone do it at 26, and with his profile, times have never been better for you. Another sought-after player will face a different sort of financial welcome to Major League Baseball. Roki Sasaki just turned 23. He is a Japanese pitcher who is widely regarded within baseball as one of the best international prospects and best pitching prospects ever. He is seen as someone who can immediately lift up a Major League staff. Ben, you wrote in The Ringer this week that he might get $600 million less than Juan Soto because no matter how good you are, Major League Baseball's rules around service time and the format for signing international free agents do not care how good you are. Could you explain that to those who may not be frequent out-of-the-park baseball sim game players?
Yes, he will be making a little more than $600,000 next season in MLB. So this was a really intriguing addition to the free agent market. It was just announced this weekend that Sasaki would be posted by his team in NPB, the Japanese major leagues, the Chiba-Lotte Marines. And there was a lot of uncertainty about when and whether he would be available because he is just 23 years old. So he makes Juan Soto look like the seasoned veteran. Soto, who has been basically the young phenom ever since he showed up and is still by far the youngest prominent MLB free agent. He's now been surpassed age-wise. He's been undercut by Sasaki. And because of MLB's international signing rules, Sasaki is not entitled to cash in. So last winter, for example, we saw the best pitcher in Japan, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, make an enormous amount of money. He signed a $325 million deal with the Dodgers. That was because he was 25 years old. And MLB's rules around these things dictate that if you are under 25 or you have not enough experience in a professional foreign league, then you cannot sign a major league contract. You have to sign a minor league contract as if you were someone who was just signed after the draft, let's say, and you have to work your way up and earn arbitration eligibility and get to free agency 6 years down the road. So he has to go through that progression, much as Ohtani did. It's the same sort of deal. Ohtani came over when he was 23, and he passed up an enormous amount of money, potentially, if he had come over 2 years later. Of course, he made it up down the road. So don't worry about Ohtani. As we discussed, his finances are solid. But Sasaki is passing up a big windfall now, taking a bit of a risk. If he were to get hurt or his performance were to go south at some point over the next couple of years before he qualifies for free agency, which won't be until 2030, then he might never get to make bank. And so he's betting on himself the way that Ohtani did. And a lot of big league teams will be betting on him too, because he is probably the most promising prospect in Japan, certainly the best pitcher in the world who has not already been in MLB.
On the Daisuke Matsuzaka scale, the way that he was seen when he came over to the Red Sox, are we talking similar for the American baseball fan who just wants a sense of the hype level that surrounds this player?
Yeah, very much in that range, or say Yu Darvish, or even Shohei Ohtani as a pitcher. Sasaki does not hit, so don't get too excited about the two-way potential, but he is that kind of pitcher. Now, he's not actually the best pitcher in Japan in terms of his overall value to this point, because he has been handled very carefully, and he has had some trouble trying to bounce back from starts, and so his innings totals are quite low. And this fits into what we've talked about on the podcast previously about the way that pitcher usage is trending, where it's just all about how effective you are on an inning per inning basis and not so much whether you're a workhorse, whether you're an innings eater. He is definitely not that. In his 4 NPB seasons, he has pitched fewer than 400 innings. Now he's compiled a 2.10 ERA. In those seasons, he has just been dominant. Some people saw him. If you're not a Japanese fan, you may have become familiar with his work in the 2023 WBC, where he was pumping triple-digit fastballs. You may also have learned of his existence back in 2022, when as a 20-year-old, he threw a perfect game with 19 strikeouts. That tied an NPB record, struck out 13 consecutive batters, which set a record. And then for his next act, his follow-up start, he threw 8 more perfect innings and was really only robbed of a second consecutive perfect game, perhaps, by workload limits. He was actually lifted 8 games into the second potential consecutive perfect game because they didn't want to work him too hard. And that's been a consistent theme. To the Marines' credit, to the credit of his high school club, they have been conscious of not overworking him. But as I said, he still had some trouble bouncing back. He missed time with sort of an unspecified arm injury or soreness or fatigue this past season, also an oblique tear. And he was kind of down compared to his 2022 and 2023 seasons, where he was basically peak Pedro Martinez or modern-day Jacob deGrom relative to his competition. His stuff and his stats were down a little bit in 2024, and it's not known whether that was a byproduct of the physical issues, whether he was maybe experimenting with some things in preparation for coming to MLB. If he were to bounce back to what he was a couple of years ago, then he would instantly be able to step into a rotation and have the sort of impact that, say, Paul Skeens did for your Pittsburgh Pirates as a rookie this past season. So that's pretty exciting. And it sets up a really interesting contrast between these top 2 free agents, because you have one guy who's going to absolutely cash in and is going to maybe sign a record contract. And so only some teams will probably be in the bidding. There are probably more that could be if they wanted to be, but some teams sort of preemptively take themselves out of the market for someone, you know, the deep end of the pool of the free agent market like Soto's swimming in. But Sasaki, in theory, could sign with anyone. And it really just depends on your bonus bonus pool money, which is just a pittance really compared to payrolls overall, and the quality of your pitch. So as we saw with Ohtani, teams are going to be making those PowerPoint presentations, those video montages, trying to sell Sasaki on why he should choose them. So if only certain teams considered themselves realistic candidates for Soto, every team can at least dream. Every fan base can say, well, we could afford Sasaki at least. Whether he will choose us is another matter.
Elephant in the room question from me. Why not wait 2 years if you're Sasaki? And you could come in at 25 and just take the big deal 2 years from now.
It's a good question. A lot of people are wondering about that. And I think it's because he really wants to compete against the best in the world. That was Ohtani's rationale. He wanted to come over and prove that he could do it. Now, NPB is the second highest level league in the world. It's traditionally seen as somewhere between the AAA level and the majors. But MLB is where the best players are. And so he wants to test himself. He wants to become more of a global star as opposed to just the domestic star that he's been since he started in high school. There's also been a question about why the Marines are posting him, are even letting him leave at this point, because typically a Japanese team, you don't qualify for free agency in NPB until you've put 9 years in. Now, some stars can be posted earlier than that, essentially if they've put several years in, right, and they've gotten to a certain age where it's deemed that they've done enough to earn the posting. And also, if they're 25 or over, then their NPB team stands to make bank too. Maybe not as much as if they could keep them forever, but they get an enormous compensation payout that is calculated as a percentage of the deal that the player signs. Now, by allowing him to be posted now, the Marines are just going to get a tiny amount compared to what they would get a couple years from now. And they are portraying it as basically looking out for his best interests. And hey, he's consistently said he wants to go over and we don't want to stand in his way. There are a lot of people, though, that suspect that there's more going on behind the scenes, that perhaps Sasaki used his leverage as the first overall draft pick back in 2019 to extract some sort of concession from the Marines that they would agree to post him when he wanted to be posted, whether a verbal or written contract, the kind of commitment that Ohtani got from his team, the Fighters, when he was drafted. And that has implications for the future of NPB, because this is the second consecutive offseason where Asian stars have really starred on the MLB free agent market, right? Last year's free agent class would have been pretty thin if not for Yamamoto and Ohtani and Jung-Hoo Lee and Yuki Matsui and players like this, and Shota Imanaga. And this year, after Soto, there was a bit of a step down and the class wasn't looking quite as sexy post-Soto. And then suddenly Sasaki comes along. And even if he probably doesn't project to make the kind of 2025 impact that, say, Corbin Burns, the best available MLB free agent veteran, might offer, teams are just so beguiled by Sasaki's talent and the fact that you're locking him up at an extremely team-friendly deal for several years to come. So you might worry that this would set a precedent in NPB if other younger amateurs there are looking at Sasaki and saying, well, we don't have to stay long in NPB. There have even been some Japanese players who have bypassed NPB entirely and have said, I'll just go directly to the minor leagues, even if I have to ride buses for several seasons. And so that maybe leads to some concerns about, can NPB retain its stars, or will they just continue to get poached by MLB, which will then brag about how global the game has gotten?
Ben, the posting system was first used, I believe, in 1999 for Alejandro Diaz, who played for Hiroshima and then signed with the Cincinnati Reds. He did not make it to the major leagues, but as you have pointed out to me, the very next person to use the posting system to come to the United States was Ichiro. Mm-hmm. So it's been a somewhat fruitful system, and obviously you mentioned Yu Darvish and Ohtani and Masahiro Tanaka and Daisuke Matsuzaka. There have been some great ones that have come through. This seems like a quite lovely system for Major League Baseball teams. And with the 20% cut or so that goes to the NPB team, it seems pretty good. It doesn't seem, really wonderful for the players of the Japanese league who might be coming over. I suppose this is outside the purview of the MLB Players Association.
It is for now, although the minor leagues used to be too, right? And now they are part of that union. And NPB has, had some labor battles of its own going on and some advocacy. Historically, the union there has not been as strong as the MLBPA, which has been one of the strongest unions in the country. And so there's been some talk of maybe amending the rules over there to get to free agency sooner, using potentially antitrust mechanisms as well as, say, work stoppages, for instance. But yeah, I mean, the roots of baseball in Japan obviously go back to the 19th century, and they are not quite as deep when it comes to players coming over to play in MLB. And, going back to the very first Masanori Murakami, who played for MLB back in the 60s, it was then a few decades until Hideo Nomo came over and used a loophole, essentially, to become a free agent and signed with big league teams. And that led to fears, MLB is going to be plundering NPB teams. It'll destroy Japanese baseball. And so we got this posting system, which has gone through various incarnations and more or less does the job. Although certainly if those players were unrestricted free agents, they could make even more. Then again, I think there is obviously some interest in protecting the health of Japanese baseball and not just making it another minor league and a feeder system for MLB. This is interesting in light of our earlier conversation about the internationalization of sports. You want to have a healthy fan base and competition in Japan. NPB has its own incredibly rich traditions. And if MLB is bragging about all of the interest from Japanese fans, then you want to foster the health of the sport there. And of course, Japanese fans follow the sport from afar. When their baseball heroes come to the US, they are followed by massive contingents of Japanese media. They are watched from overseas. There's just still a ton of attention and enthusiasm, but one could imagine that if stars just started bypassing NPB entirely, then there might be a bit more resentment. There might also be more resentment if Roki Sasaki ends up signing with the Los Angeles Dodgers, which is a distinct possibility. I know I just mentioned the Dodgers as a suitor for Soto, but he is also seen as, a likely recruit by the Dodgers. They are viewed as the favorite for various reasons, right? The Dodgers have a lengthy, rich history of Japanese players dating back to Nomo. And now, of course, with Yamamoto and Ohtani, they have a lot of bonus pool money depending on when he is actually posted. They have the track record of success and the perennial playoff appearances that we talked about last year. They just won a World Series. They have a track record of improving players. And Sasaki, as young as he is not quite a finished product, and he could probably benefit from player development. Then again, maybe he doesn't want to join a team that already has this massive spotlight and other Japanese megastars. Maybe he doesn't want to start from the top. Maybe he wants to go somewhere where he can help take a team to the top. And the Dodgers have a whole history of pitcher injuries, as we've discussed as well. So that could scare him off. There have also been some reports that say he's not someone who seeks the spotlight. He's kind of a low-profile guy, and maybe he would actually gravitate toward a smaller market team. So again, there's hope out there for one of the teams that isn't perennially in the running for the top-tier free agents. That Sasaki could still be someone they sign. After all, Shohei Ohtani signed with the Angels, first of all.
Mr. Sasaki, have you ever had French fries on a sandwich? Have you ever heard of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania?
Yes.
We'd love to have you. Things could be wonderful for you there. Up next, an Afterball for the ages.
The 2024 election means this year is going to be chock full of drama and nail-biting suspense. You deserve a politics and news podcast, expert analysis, no spin, no BS, just trusted journalists talking about what you need to know. I'm David Plotz, and each week on Slate's Political Gabfest, I sit down with the New York Times' Emily Bazelon and CBS News' John Dickerson to do just that. Join us as we unpack the latest in politics, news, and the courts. Listen to the Political Gabfest every Thursday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Ben, it is once again time for Afterballs. While it will be great fun to watch Roki Sasaki pitch in Major League Baseball, it is also going to be an incredible joy to get this week's baseball-themed Afterball. Ben, what is your Alejandro Diaz posting of the week?
Well, thanks for asking, Alex. I am channeling the spirit of Stefan Fatsis by going full word nerd today. The New York Times Tech Guild, which represents more than 600 software engineers, product managers, data analysts, and designers, is on strike and has asked subscribers to refrain from playing games such as Wordle, Connections, and the Crossword. The Guild has built its own website with similar games to tide people over, give them a fix, which you can find by Googling Guild Builds. But it's been easy for me to avoid crossing the digital picket line because I've somehow avoided an addiction to New York Times games. However, my wife is a wordler and a spelling beer and a crossword puzzler, so she's had to sacrifice some streaks in solidarity, and thus it's been a while since I've seen her working on a crossword. But based on the number of times she's come to me for help with sports-related clues in the past, I have long suspected that baseball is overrepresented in crosswords relative to the sport's current level of popularity. This past January, I had Athletics All-Star slugger Brent Rooker on my baseball podcast, Effectively Wild. I knew he was a crossword guy, so I asked him if he had noticed baseball clues coming up unexpectedly often. Do you think baseball is overrepresented in crossword puzzles compared to other sports or compared to its popularity?
I don't think so. I mean, a couple days ago, there was one of the answers was San Antonio Spurs. So you got the NBA there. NFL is in there a lot, I feel like. Sixer was also an answer recently, which was another NBA reference. Last week, Niner was one, being the 49ers reference. I think it's pretty, between the three major American league, NHL maybe is a little less represented, but I think between NBA, NFL, and MLB, I think it's pretty even. I remember being very jealous during the playoffs. Alec Boehm, who I know and have played with, was the answer to I don't remember who the second one was, but he was in the New York Times one, which I was very jealous of and thought that was kind of cool.
So Rooker kind of shut me down and made me question whether the crosswords baseball infatuation was real or whether it just seemed that way to me, maybe because my wife was more likely to ask me, an ostensible baseball expert, about the baseball clues. But I am pleased to report that the data bears out the baseball bias. Recently, an Effectively Wild listener, Raymond Chen, took it upon himself to study this question by cataloging every sports clue in a 2022 book called The New York Times Amazing Big Book of Crosswords, which contains 300 puzzles of various difficulty levels. He made a spreadsheet, which we will link to on the show page, and in his summary of the results, he began with a beautiful sentence, "Ben is right." He continued, baseball really is overrepresented. In the 300 puzzles, there were 436 sports-related clues. Of those, 166, or well over a third, are baseball-related. This is more than 2.5 times the total of the next closest sport, football, at 65. Golf, basketball, and tennis fill out the top 5. I'll note that hockey ranks 6th with 16 mentions, so Rooker was right about crosswords snubbing that sport. Other sports that got on the board, boxing, soccer, skating, badminton, horse racing, bowling, fencing, plus one clue about baseball's antecedent, cricket, which was cricketers need, answer, bat. Baseball's representation in crossword clues is consistent across all difficulty levels, whereas other sports' fortunes rise and fall, possibly due to small samples. Among the top 5 sports, golf relies most on knowing the names of players, teams, or venues as opposed to other terms. Tennis is highly dependent on player name recognition alone. If you remove the most overrepresented answers, such as tee in golf, épée in fencing, or ORR in hockey, and ot in baseball, then baseball's percentage shoots up to almost 40% of all sports clues. Hockey fades further and fencing all but disappears. So, Raymond concludes, the results confirm Ben's theory that baseball really is the dominant sport in crosswords. Take that, Brent Rooker. But why is baseball such a disproportionate star? I asked Ben Zimmer, the linguist, lexicographer, and co-host of the former Slate podcast Spectacular Vernacular, who noted that the worst baseball crosswordese is widely acknowledged to be ALer and NLer. as in American Leaguer and National Leaguer, though fortunately those rarely appear in the New York Times or elsewhere these days. Ben pointed me to a 2015 Times article in which longtime Times crossword editor Will Shortz acknowledged that ALer and NLer are not much used in the outside world, but the letter patterns are so useful for crossword constructors, it's hard to say no. And yes, there was an ALer and an NLers in Raymond's sample. Short terms like that play a part in baseball's crossword puzzle appeal, which became clear when I reached out to Shortz, who edited the puzzles in Raymond's book. Interesting question, he said. Crosswords simply include names that average people know. And for whatever reason, there seem to be more well-known baseball players than there are well-known athletes in other sports. Also, the shorter the name and the more vowels it has, the more likely it is to show up in an American-style crossword. That's part of the reason for the high frequency of Leo DeRocher, Lou Gehrig, Mel Ott, Pete Rose, Hank Aaron, Felipe Alou, Sammy Sosa, A-Rod, etc. I just checked the list of inductees in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and the names tend to be longer and not so crossword-friendly. Curiously, tennis is another sport that shows up a lot in crosswords due to the fame of leading tennis athletes and the shortness of their names, like Arthur Ashe, Monica Seles, Andre Agassi, Hanna Mandlikova, Ilya Nastase, Chris Evert, Naomi Osaka, both first and last, and lately Iga Swiatek, who just lost to WTA Finals champion Coco Gauff for the first time in a while. Will also said, sometimes it takes a while for names to enter the crossword canon. That's part of the reason for all the oldies. And yes, there are 3 uses of "ot" in Raymond's sample, as well as 1 "ots," the answer to the clue, some valuable 1920s to 40s baseball cards. Will points out that more contemporary players have also appeared in Times crosswords, including the object of Rooker's envy, Alec Boehm, along with Alec Marsh, Aaron Judge, the aforementioned Juan Soto, Gabe Kapler, Luis Severino, Robinson Cano, Tim Anderson, and of course, Shohei Ohtani. Now, I'll note that the website Defector publishes pretty sports-heavy crosswords, the first of which, contributed by Ben Zimmer, was baseball-themed. But the site's crossword submission guidelines specify that people and athletes of note beyond the Otts and Alus of the world are encouraged, especially when they fall outside the typical white male sports canon. We'd love to see more Willie O'Ree or Naomi Girma in these puzzles. So I emailed Defector crossword editor Kim Vu, who was on Hang Up this past July. Kim said, yes, baseball is almost definitely overrepresented, though the data set you have is probably incomplete. Puzzles published in New York Times books tend to lean older, and older puzzles tend to lean toward baseball clues as their sports clues. That said, I did a cursory search on X-Word Info, which is pretty complete as a database for the New York Times crossword, and since January 1st, 2020, baseball has shown up as an actual word in clues 257 times, compared to 181 for football, 163 for golf, 118 for basketball, 113 for soccer, and 63 for hockey. Keem says, I would hazard a guess that overall baseball as a share of all sports clues is probably shrinking, but still is a sizable plurality. As for why, he mentioned all those short vowel-heavy answers, but he added, more importantly, baseball has a huge incumbency advantage. Editors, by and large, tend to favor including new stuff only if it's interesting or inferable or intuitive to the average solver. So because Alu and Ott have been included so many times already in puzzles, it's taken as a given that solvers could and should know them. And since baseball and golf in their modern legible forms have been around a lot longer than other sports, their longer runs as pop culture that should be knowable by the average solver mean that more terms from those sports have entered that emeritus level. Plus, he says, baseball still occupies a spot in the imagination as America's pastime. So the average constructor, who, let's be honest, almost certainly doesn't know ball, will guess that a baseball fact is more relevant to their average solver strawman, likely a middle-aged white person, than, say, women's soccer. So as fill options come up, they're more likely to consciously or subconsciously discount references to sports they think of as less popular relative to baseball. Or put another way, if a constructor hasn't personally heard of it, they probably avoid including it. And since constructors are mostly white and mostly male, that tends to favor baseball over the WNBA or NWSL. Finally, as an example, Asia, AJA, has appeared 33 times in major publications since WNBA star Asia Wilson was drafted first overall. 5 times it was clued as the actress Asia Naomi King, 4 times as Asia Wilson, and 24 times, including all 5 New York Times instances, as the Steely Dan album. So even when constructors and editors are given a super relevant, inclusive option for a piece of fill, they still tend to hedge toward things that they think are in the mainstream cultural corpus. And again, Keem says, I'd argue that since baseball already has the longest record of facts and names in the cultural corpus, by both longevity and sheer number of players, it becomes tautological. That said, along the broader movement toward representation in crosswords, I would say there are more conscious attempts to diversify sports references in general. So, in conclusion, baseball's crossword power is waning, but for now, it's still the crossword king. So while you're waiting to tackle the New York Times crossword again, you may want to bone up on words like bloop and names like Boggs and Hobbs. Alex, are you a crossword doer?
I have occasionally done the mini in recent years in a little daily competition with some of my best friends from high school. And of the 7 of us, I am soundly 7th, I would say, in ability. I've won the daily competition all of like 3 or 4 times. But of course, not right now, not crossing the line.
No, absolutely
Ben, I am dazzled by that presentation, and I appreciate it, as do I am sure our listeners. That is all for this episode. We also have a bonus episode that is live right now about the state of Major League Soccer at the end, the premature end, some would say, of another season of Leo Messi being part of the league. To hear that, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangup+ to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Matt Brown, I am Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thank you for listening.
If there's one thing sports fans love as much as watching games, it's talking about them, especially the stats. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.